What happens when betrayal meets the ocean floor 200 feet below? When trust shatters like bones against jagged rocks, and survival becomes the only currency that matters. Sarah Martinez thought she knew her climbing partners. She trusted them with her life, literally hanging by threads of nylon and steel across some of the world's most dangerous cliff faces. But on that grey October morning off the California coast, she discovered that some people are willing to kill for secrets worth millions. They cut her rope. They watched her fall. They left her for dead. They had no idea they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because Sarah Martinez wasn't just any climber. She was a former Navy SEAL who had survived Taliban ambushes in Afghanistan, Russian operatives in the Arctic, and underwater demolition missions that would break ordinary people. And now, bleeding and broken at the bottom of a cliff, with the Pacific Ocean threatening to claim her life, she was about to remind everyone why SEALs never quit. This is the true story of betrayal, survival, and justice served cold. This is the story of how they threw her off the cliff, then learned that Navy SEALs don't rely on ropes. Sarah Martinez adjusted her climbing harness one final time as the morning fog rolled across the jagged coastline of Big Sur, California. The cliff face before her stretched 200 feet down to the churning Pacific Ocean, its dark granite surface glistening with moisture from the marine layer. She had climbed this particular route, known as Devil's Spine, 17 times before, but today felt different. Today, something in the air made her survival instincts whisper warnings she couldn't quite understand. "You ready for this, Martinez?" called out Jake Thornton, her climbing partner of 3 years. He was busy organizing the ropes and anchors, his movements precise and practiced. Jake had introduced her to this group of extreme climbers, and over time they had become some of the closest friends she had ever known, or so she thought. Sarah nodded, though her attention was divided between the technical aspects of the climb and the nagging feeling that had been growing stronger over the past few weeks. She had noticed small changes in her climbing partner's behavior, hushed conversations that stopped when she approached, glances exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking, and an increasing number of climbs scheduled without her knowledge. "Sarah's always ready," laughed Maria Gonzalez, the only other woman in their group of Sikhs. "I swear, sometimes I think she's part mountain goat." The group chuckled, but Sarah caught something in Maria's voice, a strain that hadn't been there before. The truth was, Sarah had been keeping a massive secret from her climbing friends for over 4 years. While they knew her as a freelance photography instructor who had a natural talent for extreme sports, her real identity was far more complex and dangerous. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, recently retired from the United States Navy SEALs, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Syria, and 1 classified mission in the Arctic that officially never happened. She had joined the climbing community as part of her transition back to civilian life, drawn to the physical and mental challenges that reminded her of military operations without the constant threat of enemy fire. Rock climbing had become her therapy, her way of processing the trauma of combat while maintaining the edge that 8 years of special operations had honed to razor sharpness. The morning had started like any other climbing expedition. The group met at their usual spot, a small cafe in Carmel by the Sea, at 5:30 in the morning. David Chen, their unofficial leader and the most experienced climber among them, had suggested they tackle Devil's Spine because the weather conditions were perfect. Minimal wind, good visibility, and the tides were right for the approach. But as they drove to the cliff site in David's modified climbing van, Sarah noticed that the usual banter and excitement were missing. Tommy Rodriguez, normally the jokester of the group, sat quietly in the back, constantly checking his phone. When Sarah tried to engage him in conversation about a new route they had discovered the previous week, his responses were clipped and distracted. The 6th member of their group, Alex Morrison, had been acting the most strangely of all. A former military contractor who claimed to have worked in logistics overseas, Alex had always been secretive about his background. But lately, his questions about Sarah's past had become more frequent and more specific. Just the week before, he had asked her directly about any military connections her family might have had, claiming he was interested in genealogy. Sarah's SEAL training had taught her to read people, to notice the subtle signs that indicated when someone was lying or concealing information. Everything about her friend's recent behavior set off alarm bells, but she had convinced herself she was being paranoid. After all, these were people she had trusted with her life on dozens of dangerous climbs. They had celebrated birthdays together, shared personal stories around campfires, and supported each other through various life challenges. As they began setting up the climbing equipment, Sarah's mind wandered to the real reason she had left the SEALs. It wasn't burnout or injury, as she had implied to her friends. It was because she had discovered something during her final mission that powerful people wanted to keep buried. A cache of documents hidden in an abandoned compound in northern Afghanistan had revealed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of military contracting. Companies were deliberately providing faulty equipment to American forces while skimming millions in profits. Sarah had done what any good SEAL would do. She had gathered evidence and reported it through proper channels. But instead of an investigation, she had been quietly reassigned and then strongly encouraged to take early retirement. The message was clear: forget what you saw or face the consequences. But Sarah Martinez had never been good at forgetting, and she definitely wasn't good at backing down from a fight. She had kept copies of the most damning documents, storing them in a secure location known only to herself and one trusted contact in military intelligence. Her plan had been to wait until the heat died down, then find a way to expose the corruption through civilian channels. What she hadn't counted on was that the people involved in the cover-up would be patient enough to track her down and eliminate the threat she represented. "Sarah, you're going to love this route," David said, as he finished checking the anchor points. "We've made some modifications to make it more challenging. New anchor placements, different rope configurations. It's going to test everything you've learned." The way he said it made Sarah pause. In 3 years of climbing with David, he had never made modifications to established routes without discussing them with the group first. Safety was always his top priority, and changing anchor placements without extensive testing and group consensus went against everything he had taught them about responsible climbing. "What kind of modifications?" Sarah asked, moving closer to examine the setup. Her trained eye immediately spotted several irregularities. The primary anchor was positioned in a location that would put unusual stress on the rope during the descent. The backup anchors were spaced in a configuration she had never seen before, and the rope itself seemed different, newer than their usual equipment, but somehow less substantial. "Just trust us," Jake said quickly, stepping between Sarah and the anchor setup. "We spent all last week testing this configuration. It's going to give you the ride of your life." Sarah's survival instincts, honed by countless life-or-death situations in combat zones, began screaming at her to walk away. But these were her friends. People she had shared meals with, people who had been there for her during the difficult transition from military to civilian life. People she had literally trusted with her life on previous climbs. "You know what?" she said slowly. "Maybe I should sit this one out. I'm not feeling completely focused today, and Devil Spine isn't a route where you want to be distracted." The response was immediate and telling. All 5 of her climbing partners suddenly became very insistent that she participate in the climb. David reminded her that they had driven all the way out here specifically for this route. Maria pointed out that Sarah was the strongest climber in the group and they needed her expertise. Tommy, breaking his unusual silence, laughed and accused her of getting soft in her old age. But it was Alex's response that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. "Come on, Martinez," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Live a little. What's the worst that could happen?" In her years as a SEAL, Sarah had learned that when someone asks, "What's the worst that could happen?" they usually already know the answer, and they're usually planning to make it happen. She was trapped. Walking away now would confirm whatever suspicions they had about her, and it was clear they weren't planning to let her leave anyway. Her only option was to play along and hope that her training and experience would be enough to get her through whatever they had planned. "You're right," she said with a forced smile. "I'm probably just overthinking things. Let's do this." As she approached the edge of the cliff and began her final equipment check, Sarah's mind shifted into combat mode. She mentally catalogued every piece of gear, every potential weapon, every possible escape route. The ocean below looked cold and unforgiving, but she had survived worse waters during SEAL training. The cliff face itself offered numerous hand and footholds that could be used for emergency climbing if necessary. What concerned her most was the isolation of their location. They were at least 3 miles from the nearest road, with no cell phone coverage and no other climbers in the area. If something went wrong, she would be completely on her own. "Remember," David said as he made final adjustments to her harness, "this route has some unique challenges. You'll need to trust your equipment completely and not try to improvise. The anchors are set for a specific descent pattern." Sarah nodded, but her fingers were already tracing the outline of the tactical knife she always kept hidden in her climbing boot. Old habits from her military training died hard, and she had never climbed without some form of backup weapon. Today, she was grateful for that paranoia. As she stepped to the edge of the cliff and prepared to begin her descent, Sarah caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. In the back of David's van, partially hidden under a tarp, was a shovel and what looked like a bag of lime. The kind of lime used to accelerate decomposition. They weren't planning to just kill her. They were planning to make sure her body was never found. Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL, realized she was about to fight for her life against people she had considered family. But as she felt the first subtle weakness in the rope system they had rigged, she also realized something else. They had made a critical error in their planning. They assumed that killing her would be as simple as cutting a rope and watching her fall. They had no idea that the woman they were about to betray had survived Taliban ambushes, Russian special forces, and underwater demolition missions that would break ordinary people. They thought they were throwing a helpless victim off a cliff. Instead, they were about to learn why Navy SEALs are taught that ropes are just one tool among many, and that the most important piece of survival equipment is the mind. As Sarah began her descent down Devil's Spine, she felt the rope system begin to fail exactly as she had suspected it would. But instead of panic, she felt the cold, calculating calm that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, Sarah Martinez was going to be the predator, not the prey. The first indication that Sarah's suspicions were correct came 30 feet into her descent down Devil's Spine. The rope, which should have been providing steady, reliable support, began to exhibit the telltale signs of deliberate tampering. The fibers were separating in a pattern she recognized from her demolitions training, not random fraying from use, but systematic weakening designed to fail at a predetermined point. Sarah's heart rate remained steady despite the realization that her closest friends were actively trying to murder her. 8 years of SEAL training had taught her that panic was the enemy of survival, and that clear thinking under extreme stress was the difference between life and death. She had approximately 90 seconds before the rope would fail completely, and she needed to use every one of them wisely. Above her, she could hear her climbing partners maintaining their casual conversation, discussing weekend plans and debating restaurant choices. The normalcy of their chatter while they orchestrated her death was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire situation. These weren't panicked amateurs making a desperate decision. They were calm, organized, and completely committed to seeing her die. "How's the descent looking, Sarah?" David called down, his voice carrying just the right note of friendly concern. "Any issues with the new anchor configuration?" "It's perfect," Sarah replied, her voice steady and relaxed. "Really smooth so far. You guys outdid yourselves with this setup." Even as she spoke, she was mentally calculating distances, angles, and possibilities for survival. The cliff face offered several potential hand and footholds that could be used for emergency climbing, but reaching them would require perfect timing and execution. At 50 feet down, Sarah began to hear a different kind of conversation from above, one that confirmed her worst fears and revealed the true scope of the betrayal she was facing. "She doesn't suspect anything," she heard Alex say, his voice barely carrying over the sound of ocean waves crashing against the rocks below. Martinez always was too trusting for someone with her background. Her background? That was Maria's voice, sounding confused. "What background? She teaches photography and climbs rocks." "Jesus Christ, Maria." Jake's voice was sharp with frustration. "She's a fucking Navy SEAL. Or was, anyway. Special operations, Afghanistan, the whole 9 yards. That's why we're here, remember? That's why Morrison's people are paying us enough to retire." Sarah's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. Alex Morrison hadn't been asking innocent questions about her military connections. He had been confirming intelligence that someone had already provided. The recent changes in her friend's behavior hadn't been paranoia on her part. It had been them positioning themselves for this moment. "A SEAL?" Tommy's voice carried genuine shock. "Sarah? Our Sarah who cries at dog videos and won't kill spiders? That soft-hearted act was just that, an act." David's voice was cold and matter-of-fact. Morrison showed us her service record. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Syria, classified missions that officially don't exist. She's killed more people than all of us combined. "But why?" Maria's voice was almost pleading. "Why do Morrison's people want her dead?" "What did she do?" "She has documents," Alex exclaimed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who clearly knew more than the others. "Files she took from her last mission. Evidence of a military contracting scheme that could bring down some very powerful people. People who are willing to pay 7 figures to make sure those documents never see the light of day." 7 figures? Tommy's voice perked up with interest. Each, Alex confirmed. "All we have to do is what we're already doing." The rope fails, she falls, it looks like a climbing accident. Her body gets washed out to sea, and we all walk away rich. Sarah felt a cold rage building in her chest as she listened to her friends. People she had trusted, people she had considered family, casually discuss her murder for money. But she forced herself to focus on the tactical situation. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. At 70 feet down, the rope was showing serious signs of stress. Individual fibers were snapping with tiny popping sounds, and the core of the rope was beginning to separate. Sarah estimated she had less than 30 seconds before complete failure. This was the moment where her SEAL training truly began to matter. During Hell Week, every SEAL candidate was put through scenarios designed to test their ability to think clearly and act decisively under extreme stress. One of the most challenging exercises involved equipment failure during rappelling operations. Scenarios where your primary safety systems failed and you had to improvise survival solutions in seconds.
Sarah's eyes locked onto a narrow ledge approximately 15 feet to her left and 8 feet below her current position.
The ledge was only about 2 feet wide and partially hidden by overhang, but it would provide the solid surface she needed to arrest her fall. Reaching it would require her to push away from the cliff face with enough force to clear the overhang, while simultaneously controlling her descent to avoid overshooting the narrow target. It was an incredibly risky maneuver that would require split-second timing and perfect execution. But it was also her only chance of survival. "Hey, Sarah," David called down. "You're making good time. How's the rope feeling? Nice and secure?" "Absolutely solid," Sarah replied, even as she watched another cluster of fibers snap. "You guys really know what you're doing." Above her, she heard Alex's voice again. "Rope should fail any second now. Everyone ready with the shocked reactions? Remember, we need to sell this. We're devastated friends who just watched our climbing partner die in a tragic accident. I still can't believe she's a SEAL," Maria said quietly. "She seems so normal." "That's what makes them dangerous," Alex replied. "They blend in, they make you trust them, then they destroy your life." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Alex was describing exactly what he and the others were doing to her at that very moment. The rope failure, when it came, was sudden and complete. One moment Sarah was rappelling down the cliff face in a controlled descent, and the next she was in free fall, plummeting toward the jagged rocks and churning water 130 feet below. But Sarah Martinez had trained for this exact scenario dozens of times. As soon as she felt the rope give way, she pushed hard against the cliff face with both feet, launching herself into a controlled dive toward the narrow ledge she had identified. Time seemed to slow as her SEAL training took over, her mind automatically calculating trajectory and timing. Above her, she heard the sounds of manufactured shock and distress as her former friends began their performance. "Oh my God," Maria screamed. "Sarah! Sarah!" The rope snapped, David shouted, his voice carrying just the right note of panicked disbelief. "Jesus Christ, the fucking rope snapped. Call 911, Jake yelled. "Call the Coast Guard." Maybe there's still... But their fake emergency response was interrupted by something they hadn't expected. Sarah's voice, clear and strong, echoing up from the cliff face. "Actually," she called out, her voice carrying easily through the morning air, "I wouldn't bother with that call." The sudden silence from above was deafening. Sarah had managed to arrest her fall on the narrow ledge exactly as she had planned, landing hard but in control. Her right shoulder had taken a brutal impact against the rock face, and she could feel blood running down her arm, but she was alive and functional. "What the fuck?" Alex's voice was no longer calm and controlled. "How is she?" "The rope fucking snapped. She should be... dead?" Sarah called up, her voice now carrying the cold, controlled tone she had used during combat operations. "Yeah, Alex, that was the plan, wasn't it? Cut the rope, watch me fall, collect your 7 figures from your mysterious employers." The silence from above stretched for nearly a minute, before David's voice drifted down, all pretense of friendship now gone. "Sarah, listen. You don't understand the situation you're in. These people we're working for, they're not the kind of people you can fight. They have resources, connections, power that you can't imagine. If you just give them what they want, this can all go away." "What they want is me dead," Sarah replied, already beginning to assess her options for climbing up from the ledge. "And what I want is to understand how 5 people I trusted with my life decided that money was more important than friendship."
"It's not about the money," Maria called down, her voice cracking with emotion. "Alex showed us your file, Sarah."
"You're not who we thought you were. You're a killer. You're dangerous." "I'm dangerous?" Sarah laughed. But there was no humor in it. Maria, I'm not the one who just tried to murder a friend for money. I'm not the one who spent weeks planning how to throw someone off a cliff. And I'm definitely not the one who's about to learn what happens when you betray a Navy SEAL. Above her, she could hear urgent whispered conversations. Her former friends were realizing that their carefully planned murder had just become a much more complicated situation. They had expected to watch her die and then drive away to collect their money. Instead, they now had a highly trained special operations soldier trapped on a ledge, very much alive and very angry. Sarah began her assessment of the tactical situation. She was approximately 80 feet below the cliff top, positioned on a narrow ledge with limited maneuverability. Her right shoulder was injured but functional, and she had her tactical knife, approximately 60 feet of climbing rope that had been left in her pack, and her emergency climbing gear. Above her were 5 people, at least one of whom, Alex, was clearly experienced in military or paramilitary operations. They had the high ground, superior numbers, and presumably additional weapons and equipment in their van. But they also had several critical disadvantages. They were operating on someone else's timetable and agenda, which meant they were probably under pressure to resolve this situation quickly. They had expected this to be simple and clean, which meant they weren't prepared for a prolonged confrontation. And most importantly, they had no idea what Sarah was actually capable of. Sarah, Alex's voice called down, and now she could hear the edge of desperation creeping in. Let's discuss this rationally. You're stuck on that ledge with nowhere to go. The tide is coming in, and in a few hours, that ledge is going to be underwater. We can help you off this cliff, but we need to know that you're going to be reasonable about this situation. Sarah checked her watch. Alex was right about the tide. She had maybe 4 hours before the Pacific Ocean started making her current position untenable. But 4 hours was a long time for someone with her training and experience. Help me off this cliff? Sarah called back. You mean like you helped me down here in the first place? Thanks, Alex, but I think I'll make my own arrangements. As she spoke, Sarah was already beginning to prepare for the next phase of what had become a survival situation unlike anything she had faced in combat. In Afghanistan and Syria, at least she had known who her enemies were. Here, she was dealing with the psychological trauma of betrayal by people she had loved and trusted, while simultaneously planning their defeat or destruction. You know what the really sad part is? Sarah called up to her former friends. I actually thought you cared about me. I thought we were family. We did care, Maria called down, her voice breaking. Sarah, we still care, but this is bigger than all of us. No, Maria, Sarah replied, her voice now carrying the ice-cold certainty that had made her successful in special operations. This is exactly as big as all of us. And now you're going to learn what happens when you mistake friendship for weakness. Above her, she heard the sound of boots on gravel as her former friends moved away from the cliff edge. They were regrouping, planning their next move. But they were thinking like civilians trying to clean up a mess. Sarah Martinez was thinking like a warrior preparing for battle. The hunt was about to begin. And this time, the prey was going to fight back. Sarah spent the first 30 minutes on the ledge, conducting a thorough assessment of her situation and resources. The narrow shelf of granite she occupied was approximately 8 feet long and 2 feet deep at its widest point, tapering to barely 18 inches at the southern end. It was solid and stable, carved from the cliff face by thousands of years of Pacific storms, but it offered limited space for maneuvering and no protection from above. Her right shoulder had taken significant damage during her controlled fall. The acromioclavicular joint was separated, and she could feel the distinctive grinding sensation of bone fragments. But the injury wasn't severe enough to significantly limit her mobility. She had suffered worse during SEAL training and continued to operate effectively. Pain was information, not incapacitation. Her equipment inventory was more encouraging than she had initially hoped. In addition to her tactical knife and climbing gear, her pack contained several items that could be repurposed for combat operations. 3 emergency flares, a high-intensity LED flashlight, approximately 30 feet of paracord, water purification tablets, emergency rations for 3 days, and a small first aid kit. Her climbing gear included a full set of cams, pitons, and carabiners that could be used for both scaling the cliff face and as improvised weapons. Above her, she could hear her former friends engaged in increasingly heated discussions about how to proceed. Their voices carried clearly in the morning air, providing valuable intelligence about their mental state and planning process. This is fucked. Tommy's voice was sharp with panic. This is completely fucked. She's supposed to be dead, and instead she's down there planning God knows what. Calm down, Alex replied, but his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier. She's trapped on a ledge 80 feet down a cliff face. She's injured, she has limited supplies, and the tide is coming in.
Time is on our side. Time is on our side. Jake's voice was incredulous.
Morrison's people are expecting confirmation that the job is done by noon. What exactly are we supposed to tell them?
Sorry, we dropped her off the cliff but she didn't die. We tell them there were complications, but the objective will be achieved, Alex said firmly. Martinez can't climb up with that injured shoulder, and she can't swim to safety with the currents and rocks down there. All we have to do is wait for the tide to finish what we started.
What if she tries to signal for help? Maria asked. What if there are other climbers or hikers in the area?
There aren't, David replied. I specifically chose this location because it's isolated. No cell coverage, no hiking trails, and the nearest climbers are probably 20 miles south at Point Sur. Even if someone sees emergency flares, it would take rescue teams hours to reach this location. Sarah smiled grimly as she listened to their analysis. Their tactical assessment was logical but incomplete, based on their understanding of her as a civilian climber rather than a special operations veteran. They were thinking about this situation as a problem to be managed rather than as a combat engagement against a trained enemy.
Here's what I don't understand, Tommy said, his voice carrying genuine confusion. If Sarah really is some kind of super soldier, why didn't she fight back when we were setting up the rope? Why did she just go along with it?
Because she trusted us, Alex replied.
That's the weakness of people like her. They're trained to be warriors, but they're not trained to expect betrayal from people they consider family. It's the same psychological vulnerability that allowed us to get close to her in the first place. Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest as she listened to Alex describe her emotional attachment to the group as a tactical weakness. But she forced herself to channel that anger into focus and determination. Emotion was fuel for action, not a distraction from it. The first phase of her counterattack began with psychological operations. Sarah knew that her former friends were operating under stress and time pressure, which made them vulnerable to manipulation and misdirection. She also knew that they had already begun to turn on each other, questioning decisions and assigning blame for the failure of their plan.
Alex, Sarah called up, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air. I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. About my service record and the documents you mentioned. I'm curious, exactly how much did Morrison's people tell you about what those documents contain?
The silence from above stretched for nearly a minute before Alex responded.
Enough, he said, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Enough to know that the military contracting scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah continued. Enough to know that those documents implicate 3 sitting senators, 2 Pentagon officials, and at least 1 federal judge in a conspiracy that goes back 15 years?
You're lying, Alex called down, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I?
Sarah replied. Tell me, Alex, did Morrison's people mention the name Jonathan Blackwood? How about Senator Patricia Wells? Congressman Michael Romano? Any of those names come up in your briefings? Sarah was taking a calculated risk by mentioning real names of people involved in the corruption she had uncovered. But she was betting that Alex had been given only limited information about the scope of the conspiracy, and that hearing specific names would shake his confidence in his employers. Above her, she heard urgent whispered conversations that confirmed her strategy was working. Who the fuck is Jonathan Blackwood? Jake's voice was sharp with anxiety. I don't know, Alex replied, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely uncertain. You don't know? Maria's voice was incredulous. Alex, you said you knew exactly what this was about.
You said it was just some stolen military documents. It is just stolen documents, Alex insisted, but Sarah could hear him losing control of the group's confidence.
Then, why are there names of senators and congressmen? David asked. Alex, what exactly did you get us involved in? Sarah allowed the arguments above to continue for several minutes before implementing the next phase of her psychological campaign.
You know what's really interesting? She called up. Morrison's people probably told you that I was some kind of rogue operative who stole classified information for personal gain, but they probably didn't mention that I reported everything through proper channels first. They probably didn't mention that my commanding officers refused to act on the evidence. And they definitely didn't mention that the reason I kept copies of those documents is because 3 of my fellow SEALs died in Afghanistan, using equipment that was deliberately sabotaged by the companies mentioned in those files. The silence from above was absolute. Sarah was revealing the true scope of the corruption she had uncovered. Not just financial fraud, but conspiracy to commit murder of American service members. 3 SEALs died? Maria's voice was barely audible. Marcus Thompson, aged 24, from Portland, Oregon, Sarah replied.
Daniel Kim, age 27, from Los Angeles, and James Mitchell, age 29, from Austin, Texas. They died when their oxygen rebreathers failed during an underwater demolition mission. Equipment that was supposed to be military-grade but was actually defective, civilian gear relabeled and sold to the Pentagon at military-grade prices. Jesus Christ, Tommy whispered. The same companies that killed my teammates are the ones paying you to kill me, Sarah continued. Because those documents don't just prove financial fraud, they prove that American companies deliberately sold faulty equipment to American forces, knowing that it would result in American deaths.
That's impossible, Alex said, but his voice was shaking. Is it? Sarah challenged.
Alex, how exactly did you connect with Morrison's people? Did they approach you, or did you approach them?
And how did they know about my climbing activities? How did they know about my relationship with this group? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Sarah was systematically destroying Alex's credibility and forcing her former friends to confront the possibility that they had been manipulated into becoming accessories to a much larger conspiracy.
They've been watching me for months, Sarah continued.
Which means they've been watching all of you. Which means they know your names, your addresses, your families, your financial situations. You think you're going to collect your money and walk away? You think people who are willing to kill American service members are going to trust you to keep quiet about murdering a Navy SEAL? Above her, the arguments were becoming more heated and desperate.
Alex, if this is what she says it is, we need to call this off, David said urgently. We need to get out of here right now.
We can't call it off, Alex replied, his voice now sharp with desperation. It's too late for that. Morrison's people know we're here. They know what we were supposed to do. If we don't deliver, we become liabilities.
So we're dead either way? Jake asked.
Not if we finish this, Alex insisted. Martinez is playing with your heads. She's using psychological manipulation to turn us against each other. It's textbook special operations tactics. Sarah had to admire Alex's tactical awareness, even as she prepared to destroy it completely. Actually, Alex, she called up, you're absolutely right. I am using psychological manipulation. It's a standard technique for breaking down enemy morale and creating division in opposing forces. But there's one critical difference between textbook psychological operations and what I'm doing right now. What's that? Alex called down, taking the bait. Psychological operations are most effective when they're based on truth, Sarah replied. And everything I just told you is verifiably true. Jonathan Blackwood is a senior executive at Meridian Defense Solutions. Senator Patricia Wells chairs the Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. Congressman Michael Romano sits on the House Armed Services Committee, and all three of them are specifically mentioned in the documents that Morrison's people want to keep buried. You're lying, Alex said again, but his voice had lost all authority. Call them, Sarah suggested. Call Morrison's people right now and ask them about Meridian Defense Solutions. Ask them about the equipment failures that killed Marcus, Daniel, and James. Ask them exactly how much money is involved in this conspiracy and how many people are going to die to keep it secret. The silence from above stretched for nearly 10 minutes. Sarah used the time to begin preparing for the next phase of her operation. She knew that her psychological campaign had succeeded in fracturing the group's unity and destroying their confidence in their mission. But she also knew that desperate people often made violent and unpredictable decisions. When Alex's voice finally drifted down from above, it carried a cold finality that told Sarah the time for psychological operations had passed. It doesn't matter, he said. True or false, it doesn't matter. We're committed now. Martinez dies here today, or we all die later. Those are the only options. Alex is right, David added, his voice heavy with resignation. We're in too deep to back out now. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm genuinely sorry. But this is how it has to end. Sarah checked her watch. She had been on the ledge for nearly an hour, and the tide had begun to rise noticeably. The waves crashing against the rocks below were getting closer to her position, and she could feel the salt spray on her face when the wind shifted. It was time to stop talking and start fighting. You know what, guys? Sarah called up, her voice now carrying the cold professional tone she had used during combat operations. I'm sorry too. I'm sorry that I trusted you. I'm sorry that I considered you family. And I'm sorry about what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next? Alex called down. You're about to learn why the Navy spends 2 years and $50 million training each SEAL, Sarah replied, and why we have a motto that Morrison's people should have mentioned in their briefings.
What motto? Tommy asked.
despite himself?
Sarah's response echoed clearly off the cliff face, carrying with it the promise of violence and the certainty of justice. The only easy day was yesterday. Sarah began her ascent at exactly 11:30 in the morning, timing her movement to coincide with the period when her former friends would be most distracted by their own growing panic and the approaching deadline for reporting mission completion to Morrison's people. The cliff face above her position offered a challenging but manageable climbing route for someone with her training and experience. The granite was solid and well-featured, with numerous cracks and holds that could support her weight even with her injured shoulder. More importantly, the angle of the cliff and the pattern of overhangs would provide concealment for most of her ascent, keeping her hidden from observation from above until she was within striking distance. Sarah's approach to the climb was methodical and tactical rather than athletic. Each movement was calculated to minimize noise, maximize concealment, and preserve energy for the confrontation she knew was waiting at the top. She used techniques learned during covert infiltration training, where the objective was to scale obstacles without detection rather than to achieve speed or style. The first 30 feet of climbing took her nearly 40 minutes, as she carefully tested each hold and planned her route to avoid loose rock that might create noise or fall hazards. Her injured shoulder protested with each upward movement, but she had trained extensively with simulated injuries during SEAL preparation, and she knew how to work through pain without compromising performance. As she climbed, Sarah could hear ongoing conversations from above that provided valuable intelligence about her target's mental state and positioning. The group was beginning to fracture under the stress of their failed mission and the approaching deadline. "It's almost noon," Maria said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Morrison's people are going to call soon. And what exactly are we supposed to tell them?" "We tell them the job is done," Alex replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Martinez fell off the cliff. The rope failed. It was a climbing accident. That's what we were hired to report. "Except she didn't fall off the cliff," Jake pointed out. "She's still down there, still alive, still talking about senators and military contractors and dead SEALs. That doesn't sound like mission accomplished to me." "The tide is rising," David added. "In another 2 hours, that ledge is going to be underwater. The end result is the same. Martinez dies. The method doesn't matter." "The method matters to Morrison's people," Alex said grimly. "They wanted this to look like an accident. A body that washes up 3 weeks from now with obvious signs of prolonged exposure to seawater is going to raise questions that a climbing accident wouldn't." Sarah was now 50 feet up from her ledge and approximately 30 feet below the cliff top. At this height, she could hear her former friends' conversations more clearly, and the intelligence she was gathering was becoming increasingly valuable for planning her final approach. "There's something else," Tommy said quietly. "What Martinez said about us being watched, what if that's true? What if Morrison's people have been monitoring us all along?" "Of course they've been monitoring us," Alex replied. "You don't think they would trust amateurs with a job this important without surveillance and backup plans?" "Backup plans?" Maria's voice was sharp with alarm. "What kind of backup plans?" "The kind that ensure there are no loose ends," Alex said bluntly. "If we succeed, we get paid and hopefully they leave us alone. If we fail, the implication hung in the air like a death sentence." Sarah realized that her psychological operations had been even more effective than she had hoped. Her former friends were beginning to understand that they had been manipulated into a situation where their own survival was at stake regardless of whether they succeeded in killing her. At 60 feet up, Sarah reached a small natural alcove in the cliff face that provided both concealment and a stable platform for preparing her final assault. She was now close enough to hear not just conversations but individual movements. Footsteps on gravel, the sound of equipment being moved, even the distinctive clicking of metal that suggested weapons being checked and prepared. Sarah spent 10 minutes in the alcove conducting her final equipment check and reviewing her tactical plan. She had identified at least 2 firearms among the group. The metallic sounds she was hearing were consistent with pistol slides being racked and magazines being checked. This was expected. Alex's military background suggested he would have come prepared for the possibility of armed confrontation. Her own weapons consisted of her tactical knife, climbing gear that could be repurposed as impact weapons, and 3 emergency flares that could be used for both distraction and incapacitation. More importantly, she had the advantage of surprise, superior training, and the moral clarity that came from fighting people who had betrayed her trust and threatened her life. The final 20 feet of her ascent required the most careful planning and execution. This section of the climb would bring her within visual range of anyone positioned near the cliff edge, and she would be most vulnerable during the transition from vertical climbing to horizontal combat. Sarah chose an approach route that would bring her up approximately 30 feet south of the main anchor point where her former friends had gathered. This position would put her behind a large boulder that would provide concealment for her final preparations, while allowing her to observe and assess the tactical situation before engaging. As she reached the top of the cliff and carefully pulled herself over the edge, Sarah felt the familiar calm focus that had carried her through numerous combat operations in Afghanistan and Syria. The physical challenge of the climb was complete. Now came the infinitely more complex challenge of neutralizing 5 armed opponents without sustaining fatal injuries herself. From her concealed position behind the boulder, Sarah could see the entire layout of her former friend's position. David and Jake were standing near the cliff edge, apparently discussing repelling options for retrieving her body after the tide finished the job they had started. Maria was sitting on a piece of climbing equipment about 20 feet back from the edge, clearly struggling with the emotional weight of their actions. Tommy was pacing nervously near the vehicles, checking his phone repeatedly and jumping at every sound. Alex was the most dangerous threat in the group. He had positioned himself in a central location where he could observe all approaches to their position, and Sarah could see the distinctive outline of a pistol holstered under his jacket. His military training was evident in his posture and positioning. He was thinking tactically about security and threat assessment, in a way that the others were not. Sarah's initial plan was to neutralize Alex first, using stealth and surprise to eliminate the most dangerous opponent before the others could react effectively. But as she prepared to move, her tactical assessment was interrupted by the sound of an incoming phone call. "It's them," Alex said grimly, pulling out his cell phone. "Morrison's people." The phone conversation that followed provided Sarah with intelligence that fundamentally changed her understanding of the situation and her approach to resolving it. "Morrison," Alex said as he answered the call. "Yes, we're at the site." "No. There have been complications. She fell, but she didn't." "What? What do you mean the target has changed?" Sarah watched Alex's face go pale as he listened to instructions from his handlers. "All of us?" Alex asked, his voice barely controlled. "But that wasn't the deal. I understand. Yes, I understand the consequences of failure." Alex ended the call and stood in silence for nearly a minute before addressing the group. "Change of plans," he said finally. "Morrison's people have decided that the situation has become too complicated and too visible. They're concerned about potential witnesses and loose ends." "What does that mean?" David asked. "It means the contract has been expanded," Alex replied. "Martinez was supposed to die in a climbing accident. Now we're all supposed to die in a climbing accident." The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. Sarah watched as her former friends processed the reality of their situation. They had been manipulated into attempting murder, and now they were themselves marked for death by the same people who had hired them. "That's impossible," Jake said weakly. "We did exactly what they asked us to do. The rope failed, Martinez fell. It's not our fault she survived." "It doesn't matter whose fault it is," Alex replied. "Morrison's people consider us compromised. They have cleanup teams en route to this location. Our job now is to create a believable accident scene where all 6 of us died during a climbing expedition." "All 6 of us?" Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "Martinez, you, me, everyone," Alex confirmed. "They wanted to look like our anchor system failed and we all fell together. A tragic accident that kills the only witnesses to their operation." Sarah realized that the tactical situation had just become infinitely more complex. Her former friends were no longer just her enemies. They were also potential allies in a fight against the people who wanted all of them dead. But they were also still the people who had tried to murder her less than 2 hours earlier. "How long do we have?" Tommy asked. 20 minutes, Alex replied. "Maybe 30 if we're lucky." Sarah made her decision. The approaching cleanup teams represented a threat that none of them could handle alone, but together they might have a chance of survival. And despite everything that had happened, she found that she still couldn't bring herself to watch Maria and the others be murdered by Morrison's people. Sarah stepped out from behind the boulder, her hands visible, but ready to move quickly if necessary. "Hello, Alex," she said quietly. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. David and Jake spun around in shock, Maria screamed, and Tommy dropped his phone. But it was Alex's reaction that concerned Sarah most. His hand moved immediately toward his concealed weapon, and she could see him calculating distances and angles of fire. "Sarah," Alex said carefully, his hand hovering near his holster. "I have to say, I'm impressed. That climb should have been impossible with your injuries." "A lot of things should have been impossible today," Sarah replied, "but here we are."
Here we are, Alex agreed.
And now we have a problem that's bigger than just the bad blood between us. Morrison's people, Sarah said. You heard? Enough. Cleanup teams, expanded contract, everyone dies in a climbing accident. How much of a head start do we have? Maybe 20 minutes, Alex replied. And before you ask, no, we can't outrun them. They have helicopters, ground teams, and probably satellite tracking on our vehicles. What about fighting them? Sarah asked. You mean the 5 of us and whatever weapons we brought for a climbing trip against professional military contractors with unlimited resources? Alex shook his head. We wouldn't last 10 minutes.
Sarah looked at each of her former friends in turn, reading their faces and body language.
They were terrified, desperate, and beginning to understand that their only chance of survival lay in working with the woman they had tried to murder.
There is another option,
Sarah said finally. What option? Maria asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since the rope had failed, and it was not a pleasant expression. Morrison's people are coming here expecting to clean up a failed operation and eliminate some amateur climbers who got in over their heads, she said. They're not expecting to face a Navy SEAL who's had 2 hours to prepare a battlefield and who now has very good reasons to kill every person involved in this conspiracy.
You want to fight them? David asked incredulously.
I want to destroy them, Sarah replied, and if you want to live through the next hour, you're going to help me do it. Above them, the sound of approaching helicopters began to echo off the cliff face. The transformation of the cliff top from climbing site to battlefield took exactly 18 minutes. Sarah Martinez, drawing on 8 years of special operations training and 3 combat deployments, orchestrated the defensive preparations with the efficiency and precision that had made her legendary among her SEAL teammates. Her former friends, no longer enemies but not yet trusted allies, followed her instructions with the desperate focus of people who understood that their survival depended entirely on her tactical expertise. The approaching helicopter sounds were growing louder, and everyone could hear the distinctive whine of multiple aircraft converging on their position. David, Jake, I need you to move all the climbing gear to that outcropping about 50 meters north, Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the authority she had used during combat operations. Create a false position that looks like we're trying to hide there. Leave obvious signs, food wrappers, water bottles. Anything that suggests we're holed up in that location. Maria, you're going to be our communications specialist. Use Tommy's phone to call 911 and report a climbing accident with multiple injuries at our current coordinates. When they ask for details, tell them we have climbers trapped on the cliff face and we need Coast Guard rescue helicopters immediately. What good will that do? Maria asked, already dialing the emergency number. The Coast Guard can't get here in time to help us fight Morrison's people.
They don't need to help us fight,
Sarah replied. They just need to be en route to this location with their own helicopters and rescue teams. Morrison's people can't operate freely if there are federal agencies responding to an emergency in the same area. Alex, Sarah continued, turning to face the man who had orchestrated her betrayal, you're going to be my tactical advisor. You know how military contractors operate, and I need to understand their likely approach and capabilities. Alex nodded grimly. 3 helicopters, probably 2 transport birds with 6 operators each and 1 command bird with surveillance equipment. Standard contractor loadout. Assault rifles, body armor, military-grade communications. They'll fast rope to the ground and establish a perimeter while the command helicopter maintains overwatch. Weaknesses? Sarah asked. They're used to overwhelming civilian targets, Alex replied. Standard contractor operations involve massive superiority in numbers, equipment, and training. They won't be expecting organized resistance from prepared positions. Tommy, Sarah called to the youngest member of their group. I need you to gather every piece of metal climbing gear we have. Carabiners, pitons, anything heavy and sharp. You're going to help me create some unpleasant surprises for anyone who tries to approach our actual position. As her former friends moved to carry out their assignments, Sarah began preparing what military tacticians call a kill box, a carefully prepared area where every approach route was covered by overlapping fields of fire and obstacles. The clifftop location provided natural advantages for defense, with limited approach routes and excellent visibility of incoming threats. Sarah's primary weapons were still limited, her tactical knife, climbing gear repurposed as projectiles, and the 3 emergency flares that could serve as both weapons and signaling devices. But she also had something that professional military contractors rarely encountered: intimate knowledge of the terrain, time to prepare defensive positions, and the desperate motivation of someone fighting for their life and the lives of people she still cared about despite their betrayal. The first helicopter appeared over the southern horizon at exactly 12:47 in the afternoon. It was a civilian aircraft painted in neutral colors, but Sarah's trained eye immediately identified the modifications that marked it as a military contractor vehicle: reinforced landing skids for fast rope operations, side-mounted equipment pods, and the distinctive antenna array of military-grade communications equipment. "Contact!" Sarah called out. "Single bird approaching from the south, probably the command helicopter. David, Jake, are you in position at the false site?"
In position.
David's voice called back from the northern outcropping. "We can see you and the helicopter from here." "Maria, what's the status on Coast Guard response?" Sarah asked. "They're dispatching 2 rescue helicopters and a ground team," Maria replied. "Estimated time of arrival, 25 minutes. 25 minutes, Sarah muttered. "We need to hold this position for 25 minutes against professional killers with overwhelming firepower advantage." "Sarah," Alex said quietly, moving to a position beside her behind the main defensive boulder. "There's something else you need to know about Morrison's people." "What?" "They have rules of engagement that prohibit leaving witnesses." "Even if we surrender, even if we cooperate completely, they're going to kill all of us. This isn't a rest and arrogant operation. It's total elimination." Sarah nodded grimly. She had suspected as much, but having it confirmed eliminated any possibility of negotiation or surrender. This was a fight to the death, and the only acceptable outcome was complete victory over Morrison's forces. The command helicopter made 2 passes over the clifftop area, obviously conducting reconnaissance and looking for signs of the targets they had been sent to eliminate. Sarah watched through a small gap between rocks as the aircraft circled, noting the positions of observers and the likely locations of surveillance equipment. "They're mapping our position," she told Alex. "Standard reconnaissance pattern. The transport helicopters will be here in less than 5 minutes. There." Alex pointed toward the eastern horizon. 2 birds, military formation, approaching fast. Sarah could see them now. 2 larger helicopters flying in tactical formation, their flight path designed to approach the clifftop from different angles simultaneously. These would be the transport aircraft carrying the teams tasked with eliminating her and her former friends. "Everyone stay low and stay quiet," Sarah commanded. "Let them think we're hiding in the false position. We need them to commit their forces before we reveal our actual defensive setup." The next few minutes unfolded with the terrifying precision of a military operation executed by professionals who had performed similar missions dozens of times. The 2 transport helicopters approached the clifftop in perfect coordination, one touching down near the northern outcropping where David and Jake had created the false position, the other landing near the main climbing area where Sarah's group was actually concealed. Sarah watched 12 heavily armed contractors fast rope to the ground with fluid efficiency. They were equipped exactly as Alex had predicted: assault rifles, body armor, military communications, and the confident movements of people who expected this to be a routine elimination mission. 8 of the contractors moved immediately toward the northern outcropping where they had detected signs of human presence. The remaining 4 began a systematic search of the main clifftop area, working in 2-person teams with professional coordination. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for, the point where Morrison's forces were divided and committed to clearing areas that either contained no targets or put them at maximum disadvantage for the counterattack she was planning.
"Alex," Sarah whispered, "when I give the signal, I need you to use your weapon to engage the search team moving toward our position."
"You don't need to hit them. Just force them to take cover and break up their formation." "What about the team at the false position?" Alex asked. "David and Jake are going to create a distraction that will keep that team occupied," Sarah replied. "On my mark, they're going to set off an emergency flare and start shouting for help." Natural reaction for trapped civilians. "And then?" "Then I'm going to do what I was trained to do," Sarah said grimly. The moment came exactly as Sarah had predicted. The search team, moving toward their concealed position, approached to within 20 meters of their defensive location, close enough for Sarah to hear their tactical communications and see their equipment clearly. 2 targets confirmed at northern position, she heard one contractor report through his radio. "No movement detected at primary climbing area. Recommend we converge on confirmed target location." That was the signal Sarah had been waiting for. The moment when Morrison's forces believed they had located and contained their targets, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack from an unexpected direction. "Execute," Sarah whispered into her improvised communication system. The sequence of events that followed demonstrated why Navy SEALs are considered the most elite special operations force in the world. Sarah moved with the fluid, deadly efficiency that had been drilled into her through 2 years of the most demanding military training available to American forces. Her first target was the closest contractor, a man who had positioned himself approximately 15 meters from their concealed location with his back partially turned toward her position. Sarah covered the distance in complete silence, using terrain and concealment to remain invisible until the moment she struck. The contractor never knew what hit him. Sarah's tactical knife found the gap between his body armor plates with surgical precision, and he was unconscious before he could make a sound. His weapon and communications equipment became Sarah's, fundamentally changing the tactical balance of the engagement. Alex engaged the second contractor exactly as planned, forcing the man to take cover behind a small boulder and breaking radio contact with his team. This created the confusion and communications breakdown that Sarah needed to continue her attack without alerting the larger force. At the northern position, David and Jake executed their part of the plan with desperate effectiveness. The emergency flare and calls for help drew the 8-person team into the prepared kill zone, where they found themselves engaged in a confusing firefight with targets who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah's second and third targets fell to a combination of captured weapons fire and improvised explosives created from climbing gear and emergency flares. The contractors were trained and experienced, but they were also operating under the assumption that they were facing trapped civilians rather than a special operations veteran fighting on prepared ground. By the time Morrison's forces realized that their routine elimination mission had become a pitched battle against a highly trained opponent, they had already lost nearly half their operational strength and all tactical initiative.
Command, this is Ground Team Leader. Sarah heard through the captured radio.
We have multiple casualties and are taking effective fire from prepared positions. Request immediate backup and medical evacuation. Negative on backup, came the reply from the command helicopter. Mission parameters require complete elimination of all witnesses. Continue operation until objective is achieved. Sarah smiled grimly as she heard the radio exchange. Morrison's people had just confirmed that they were committed to total elimination regardless of casualties, which eliminated any possibility of negotiation or withdrawal. This was now a fight to the finish, and Sarah intended to be the one left standing. The tide of the battle turned definitively in Sarah's favor when the Coast Guard rescue helicopters appeared on the horizon exactly 22 minutes after Maria's emergency call. The presence of federal aircraft over the operation area forced Morrison's command helicopter to withdraw to avoid being detected and identified, leaving the remaining ground forces without air support or tactical coordination. The final phase of the engagement was swift and decisive. Sarah used the communications equipment captured from the contractors to coordinate with Alex, David, Jake, Maria, and Tommy in a series of flanking maneuvers that systematically eliminated the remaining hostiles. When the Coast Guard helicopters landed on the clifftop 31 minutes after the first shots were fired, they found 6 civilians who had successfully defended themselves against what they described as an armed robbery attempt by unknown assailants. The bodies of Morrison's contractors were consistent with defensive actions taken by people fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Sarah's official statement to federal investigators was a masterpiece of misdirection and selective truth. She described the group's climbing expedition, the equipment failure that had caused her fall, and the subsequent attack by unidentified armed men who had apparently been waiting in the area for targets of opportunity. The investigation that followed focused on identifying the attackers and determining their motives, but without access to the classified documents that Sarah had hidden, investigators could not establish connections to the military contracting conspiracy. The official conclusion was that the group had been targeted by professional criminals, possibly connected to drug trafficking operations in the area. Alex Morrison was found 3 days later in his apartment in San Diego, dead from an apparent suicide. The note he left behind confessed to organizing the attack on Sarah's climbing group in exchange for money from unnamed criminal contacts. But it made no mention of military contractors or government corruption. Senator Patricia Wells, Congressman Michael Romano, and Meridian Defense Solutions executive Jonathan Blackwood continued their careers without interruption, unaware that the evidence of their crimes remained hidden in a secure location, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Sarah Martinez returned to her cover identity as a freelance photography instructor, but with a new understanding of the lengths to which powerful people would go to protect their secrets. She also had 5 former friends who now shared her knowledge of the conspiracy and her commitment to eventual justice. 6 months later, when copies of the classified documents were simultaneously released to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and 60 Minutes, the resulting investigation brought down the entire military contracting network and sent 17 people to federal prison. The story of their betrayal and redemption on the cliff tops of Big Sur remained their secret. But Sarah Martinez had learned something important about the nature of trust, the value of friendship, and the price of justice. Some betrayals can be forgiven. Some secrets are worth dying for. And sometimes, the only easy day really was yesterday. The last entry in Sarah's private journal, written exactly 1 year after the cliff incident, read simply, "They threw me off the cliff thinking I needed a rope to survive. They learned too late that Navy SEALs are taught to improvise, adapt, and overcome." But the most important lesson was one I had to learn for myself. Sometimes the people who betray you are the same people worth saving. Justice had been served. The truth had been revealed. And Sarah Martinez had finally found peace with both her past as a warrior and her future as a guardian of secrets that powerful people preferred to keep buried. The ocean still crashed against the rocks below Devil's Spine, but now it sounded like applause.